Hi there, everybody. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. Waiting for a couple more people to join us. So welcome to this evening's Retirement Masterclass, which is focusing on changes to the pensions allowances and what they mean for you. Quickly to introduce myself, my name is Celeste. I'm Head of Marketing at Flying Colours, and I'm just going to introduce you to George Agan, who's going to be presenting from Flying Colours, and also Andrew Tully, who is joining us from Nucleus. Andrew will be telling you a little bit more about Nucleus, what they do and what he does there. But for now, I'd just like to take you through a few housekeeping aspects. The first thing to mention is that this evening's event is purely for information and educational purposes. What we're going to talk about this evening should not be taken as financial advice. Because we are talking about pensions predominantly, pensions are an investment, and therefore we should make you aware that, as with all investing, your capital is at risk. So we've put this presentation together based on current tax legislation, but as we all know, that's always subject to change and can be applied retrospectively, which makes things very complicated, which is why we need the experts to come and tell us all about it. So to quickly run you through the agenda for this evening, we're going to be talking through changes to tax allowances and why they matter to you. Importantly, how they impact you and the kind of expensive mistakes that we come across when we're advising clients, and importantly, how you can avoid them. We'll be talking about the new lump sum allowances, and we'll also be talking you through a planning example, looking specifically at cash flow planning as a means of making sure that you can plan the best you can, particularly for your retirement. We've then got a session for Q&A. We have received a lot of questions in advance of this webinar, so we will do our very best to answer them with the content that we prepared for you this evening, but also as part of the Q&A session. But just a heads up, we may not be able to get through all of them, but we will do the best we can. There is not a Q&A function on this webinar, but there is a chat, and you are welcome to put your questions and comments on there. But again, we'll do our very best to get through as many as we can. For those whose questions we can't answer, we will drop you an email in the coming days with at least an outline response to your query. So now I shall hand over to George, who will start to talk you through the main changes to pension allowances.
Thanks very much, Celeste. That's great. And thank you, everyone, for joining me tonight. So basically, I'm just going to go over kind of the context in why this matters. Andrew's going to be helping, and towards the end of the Q&A, we're going to be talking about a lot of technical stuff, and that's great. But what I want to try and add is just a bit of context. Why does that matter? And why I think potentially we could be in a position right now, obviously no promises, but why pensions could be the most generous they'll ever get, and how that can impact your retirement and your planning. So why am I saying that? Why am I saying the pensions might be the most generous they'll ever be? Well, basically, for an individual, you get tax relief at your marginal rate at the moment. Now, there's always rumours swirling around as far as is it going to change to relief at flat rate like 30%? We don't know. We can't kind of second guess these things. But at the moment, we've got to make hay while the sun shines. And we do know that depending on what level of income you've got, you can get tax relief at 20, 40, 45%, maybe even 60% if you're affected by the 100K tax trap. But you can also get similar levels of relief if you've got a limited company, because of pensions can be corporation tax deductible. So they're really generous on the way in. We now know that there's no lifetime allowance limits, which we're going to go over and all the details there, but that's been a big change. There's tax-free cash lump sums that you get on the other end, which means that when you take money out of the pension, you're likely what you're going to extract at, the marginal rate you'll extract at one way or the other from the pension is going to be typically much lower than if you get 40, 45% or above tax relief. So you need to take those opportunities potentially. And pensions are one of the rare things that we have, which are both outside of your estate for inheritance tax, subject to your scheme having the relevant rules and trustee discretion and all the rest of it, but also remain in your lifetime in your control. So my key message here is that, look, pensions are really generous. When the lifetime allowance was abolished, they became more generous. So we need to try and navigate these rules. But what are the rules? I'm just going to go over the high level allowances and some of the big misconceptions and mistakes I see from people, prospective clients and people we advise. Okay, everyone knows the high level annual allowance. It's £60,000. However, what you can put into a pension may well not be £60,000, because effectively what £60,000, your annual allowance, so your annual allowance for each year, that's your and your employer's contributions that you can pay into your pension. However, if you're making individual contributions, that's actually limited to what's called your relevant earnings, which is very simply and at a very high level is income, salary, bonus, and all the rest of it. Now, why does that matter? Well, let's say just for a second your employer's not contributing at all, and you were wanted to put money into a pension. The gross contribution you could put into a pension if you were earning, say, £40,000 would be 40,000 after tax relief. So while the annual allowance is 60, in that very simplistic example, you might not actually be able to put in 60,000 and get tax relief if you don't have relevant earnings. Now, to make things even more complicated, let's say you're earning much more than £60,000. Well, you've got the opportunity to potentially carry forward the last 3 years of allowances. So actually, though, again, 60,000 is the headline for the annual allowance, that's not to say that you can only put £60,000 into a pension. So going back to that real generosity about the tax reliefs, you actually might potentially be able to put quite a bit more into a pension, and it might be worthwhile you doing this. However, we've got to also be mindful that if you flexibly access a pension, so you, for example, you take taxable income from a money purchase scheme, your 60,000 could go down to 10, triggering what's called the money purchase annual allowance. So you need to be really careful if you do decide to withdraw from a pension to make sure that you're at least intentional if you do decide to trigger that. And if you're earning a lot, I just talked about a second the potential benefits if you're earning more than 60,000. Well, you might need to navigate the tapered annual allowance. So what's the tapered annual allowance? And well, there were some changes here in 2023, which I'm just going to go over because I think it is relevant to some of you based on the questions we've had in. So the tapered annual allowance is effectively the government saying, look, you're earning quite a bit of money. We think that the current pension regime is perhaps a little bit too generous, and we're going to reduce your annual allowance. So you're now 60,000 allowance if you're earning of a certain level. Very high level. There are two tests. Threshold income is effectively all your taxable income minus, for example, things like relief at source pension contributions. What adjusted income does is it then adds back in your employer contributions. And the idea around this is basically so you can't game the system with things called salary sacrifice and so forth. That's very high level. And if you are affected by the taper, you're going to need to take some advice because this is slightly in the deeper end of financial planning. But I just want to show you this graph, which I really like from LCP, which just shows the changes that happened in 2022, 2023 for the taper and the position going forward. So the key thing is that in the pink, this was when the annual allowance was 40,000. The annual allowance is now 60,000, so that's moved up. But what also happened is instead of the taper going all the way down to 4,000, the taper now goes to 10,000. So as you can kind of see, this gap where you've now got the taper having a lesser impact, still an impact, of course, but a lesser impact, that is a key planning opportunity. And I have, for quite a few of my clients, I've gone back and we've rejigged the calculations and we've realised that they now have more scope for planning, which is especially important considering the lifetime allowance changes, which Andrew's going to go over in quite a few details. So the takeaway here is that if you were affected by tapering, it's probably advisable to have a look at those calculations and to see whether you should maybe be making more contributions or whether you should adjust your strategy. We now have the lump sum allowances. So going forward, we're going to be in a lump sum testing world. And the only people who would have understood that will be the financial professionals listening, because that won't make sense to anyone else. But we now have the lump sum allowance and the lump sum death benefit allowance. The lump sum allowance is effectively tax-free cash for all intents and purposes of 268,275. And the lump sum and death benefit allowance, assuming no lifetime allowance protections, is set to the previous lifetime allowance of 1,073,100. We're going to be going into things like transitional certificates and all the rest of it in a second with Andrew. But just before we do, I told you I was going to say about why this matters. And I just want to kind of highlight why, more so than ever, the plan makes such a difference. And with retirement, all this technical stuff is fantastic, but it is only theoretical unless it's applied to your specific financial plan for your retirement. And why is it important to plan? I just want to take a really high level thing, because I actually think this is probably going to be one of the most valuable concepts I can leave you with beyond the technical. Because most of the people I advise tend to come to me and they have this idea of retirement. Let's say they want to retire at 60 because perhaps their pension scheme told them that was the time that would be advisable to retire. You've got your state pension age, you've got your life expectancy judged by ONS, which tends to be 86 or 87, depending on if you're a man or a woman. And this is kind of the journey, going down to the probability of getting to 100 being relatively low, assuming you're 100% life expectancy because you're alive at 60. It's your lifespan. And that's how a lot of people have a conception of thinking about retirement. I think we need to be considering this in a different light. And I think we need to be considering this in the idea of thinking about health span. So what's health span? There's different ways of testing it, but it's effectively the number of years you're going to have of your retirement where you're going to be in good health, have no illness, disability, disease-free years, as nice as that particularly sounds. But if you have a look at health span and we then mark things like state pension age and ONS life expectancy, health span is considerably lower. This is on average, depending on what kind of stats you look at. And why is that so important for retirement? Well, not all years, I think, when you're planning, should be treated equally. And when we're coming down to the technical, everything has to be understood that, okay, what is the life you've worked so hard to achieve? How can we make the most of it? Because there's no good planning for something if you're not you don't have the ability and the health to enjoy it. So when I think about planning, I'm always talking to my clients and saying, okay, well, look, depending on the stats, so depending on whether you're in maybe a local authority which has a high healthy life expectancy or a low, like my late father came from Ashington, which has been the northeast, so that would have been particularly low as far as the proportion who would have been in the local authorities for healthy life expectancy. Anyway, if we think about that as a period of time from where you may be right now, maybe 55, 58, chances are, looking at the stats, we're looking at something of around a 12-year, 15-year period. And when we think 12 years ago was the London Olympics, it's not that long ago, which is why we need to really be very intentional with the planning. And in my view, we need to be thinking about 3 phases of retirement. The go-go years, where you're able to enjoy things, maximize what you've been working for. The slow go years, where things are going to slow down. You're not going to go on as many big holidays, but you're still going to want to do things. And then playfully called the no-go years. This is from Michael Kitces, I believe, where, as I'm sure quite a few of you listening will have had older parents, you'll notice that actually in the later years, of course, we need to be mindful of things like care, but actually spending tends to decrease. So that's a key thing we need to think about, the difference between overspending and underspending, so that we get that balance right, that you enjoy the retirement that you've worked hard for, and you don't become the richest person in the graveyard. So just before we go into the technicals that Andrew's going to deliver, I want to leave you with one question just to overhang that. What has a bad reputation but gets better client feedback than Apple? What has a bad reputation but gets better client feedback than Apple? Andrew, over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks, George. So hopefully you can now all see my slides. So George has set me up and asked me to look at particular changes to the lifetime allowance, which is coming shortly in a few weeks' time, and abolishing the lifetime allowance. Before we actually got to that, I thought it was worthwhile just spending 1 minute on, you might not have heard of Nucleus, you might be wondering who I am and what our credentials are to talk to you about. So Nucleus is a financial platform. Fancy language. Basically, we're a software provider. We provide what we believe is nice software and allows financial advisors like Flying Colours to manage all of your assets in one place. So whether that's pensions or ISAs or investments, whatever it happens to be, all in one place, so it's easy to manage and track and ultimately use as and when you want to take money out. We are not financial advisors, so I'm not here to give you advice. But we work with financial advisors across the UK. We don't sell direct to customers, so we work purely through financial advisors. This is complex stuff, and I'll try and not make it too complex, but it is complicated stuff. We believe financial advisors are really, really important. As far as size of our business, it says we look after 80 billion of assets there. We've just bought another company. It's just going all through all the regulatory details and things like that. That would take us to about 90 billion of assets under management. So we're a sizable business. We look after lots of people's money. We take that very, very seriously. Our aim is to help make retirement more rewarding. So retirement is where we specialize in. So hopefully that just gives a little bit of foresight. What I'm going to be talking about is where we see ourselves as specialists in this retirement market. So George has touched on quite a bit of this, so I'm not going to spend long on it, but pensions have got great tax reliefs. So they're a very helpful planning tool that you can get tax relief on the way in, so a government bonus kind of on the way in. Once your money's in a pension, it grows nice and tax efficiently there. 25% normally as a tax-free lump sum when you come to take benefits. That's probably one of the best known bits of pensions, and probably one of the best loved bits of pensions is that ability to take tax-free cash at retirement. And then if you should die, pensions can be a very tax efficient way of passing money down to your family. So lots of positives. There's a couple of caveats to that. The first one is that your money is locked away. So generally your money can't be touched once it's inside the pension. It can't be touched. And at the moment, until 55, that's going up to 57 from 2028. So in a few years. And there's limits. So the government and all governments give tax relief and tax benefits to pensions. But they limit that. So there's limits on the way in, which George has talked about, and there's also limits on the way out, which is what I will talk about. So once you want to take your money, there's a limitation to what you can get in a tax efficient way. So what we used to have was the lifetime allowance, and that so I'm not going to spend long on this because this is effectively, this is now abolished. So we've got rid of this, but you might have come across it. You might have heard it before, which was a lifetime allowance. It was introduced in 2006. It has varied over time. So it started off at 1.5 million. It grew, and then successive governments cut that until it was just above £1 million. But in the budget just about a year ago, the government announced that they were going to abolish the lifetime allowance. Because that's quite complex, because the lifetime allowance is throughout pensions legislation, they had to do that in two phases effectively. So from last April 2023, they removed what was called the lifetime allowance tax charge. So if you had money over and above the lifetime allowance, it previously got a special tax charge, quite a penal tax charge applied to that excess over and above the lifetime allowance. And so from April last year, that penal tax charge was removed. But the lifetime allowance still existed. So if you took benefits, pension providers still had to measure you against that lifetime allowance. What we're coming to in a few weeks' time, so from April 2024, is the lifetime allowance is going to be abolished entirely. So we get rid of it completely. And that sounds great, and that sounds really simple. And I think it is simpler what we're going to do. However, there are in its place 2 new allowances. And again, George mentioned these names earlier. So the lump sum allowance. So that's the maximum that you can take as tax-free lump sum. So you can take 25% of your pot normally, but up to a maximum of 268,275. It's unfortunate it's not a nice round number, but that's where we are. So 268,275 is the maximum tax-free lump sum you can receive. And the second one, which is a lump sum and death benefit allowance, which is the maximum you can receive as a tax lump sum in your lifetime, a tax-free lump sum within your lifetime, and also any tax-free lump sums payable on your death before age 75. So we'll look at those, just an example of those in a second. Those are the standard numbers. Those are the numbers that apply to the vast majority of people. But there are a few people who had a special deal in the old world, which was called protection. So some of you on the call might have had some sort of protection. If you had that special deal in the past, it largely continues into the future. There might be a few tweaks in a couple of situations, but largely it continues. And so you would have a higher lump sum allowance or a higher lump sum and death benefit allowance. So a quick example on the lump sum allowance. So let's say I get to July, or Peter in this case, our example. Peter gets to July. He's got two different pots. His first pot is worth £400,000, and he decides to buy an annuity. So he can take 25% of that as a lump sum. That's a normal situation. So he can get £100,000 as a tax-free lump sum. The other £300,000 goes to buy an annuity. In the new world, we don't care about that £300,000. We don't measure it. We only measure tax-free lump sums. So that 300,000 is effectively irrelevant. Nobody measures it. No one tests it. The only thing that we test going forward is the 100,000 tax-free lump sum. So assuming Peter's got the normal, he starts off with 268,275. He's taken 100. And what he has left for future is 168,275. So it just works in a simple monetary amount, taking off from this initial 268,275 value. The following year, Peter decides to take his second pot. His second pot's worth £800,000. So normally you would expect to get 25% of that tax-free. So that would be £200,000. But in Peter's example, his lump sum allowance remaining is 168,275. So the most he can get as a tax-free lump sum is 168,275. So that limits it down. And the remaining amount in this situation goes into drawdown. And what he would do is he would face income tax when he decided to take that out. So there's no penal tax charges anymore, but he would be liable to income tax when he takes that money out. So again, it's about trying to plan maybe when you take that money out and trying to take it out so you pay as little tax potentially as possible. So that's the first one, which is a lump sum allowance. The second one is the lump sum and death benefit allowance. So perhaps confusingly, this also takes off tax-free cash. So tax-free cash comes off both allowances. So that's slightly odd. But again, just a quick example. So Abigail, in this case, 800,000 into drawdown. So that's her first pot. She takes £200,000 as tax-free cash. So that £200,000 comes off the 107,300. It would also have come off the lump sum allowance, but we're looking specifically at a second allowance. So she's got 873,000 going forward. She's also got another pot which she's not touched at all, and that's worth £1 million. And unfortunately, she dies. She dies before 75. So before 75, we know is generous tax treatment that can be paid out generally tax-free, but it's only tax-free up to that remaining lump sum and death benefit allowance if it's paid as a lump sum. So in this case, the tax-free lump sum that would be paid to Abigail's family is limited to 873,100, and the excess between that and the 1 million, so 120,000 or so, that would be liable to income tax. So again, no penal tax charges, but it would be liable to income tax. However, there's quite an easy way around this. I don't want to call it a loophole because it's not a loophole, it's perfectly allowable, but there's an easy route around this if you're using a pension scheme, a personal pension or a SIP type pension, an individual contract to you. And what that allows you to do is to pass the money to your family and it remains inside the pension wrapper. So if I died, for example, I could pass it into a pension in my wife's name. That's not a lump sum, that's giving it to her as a pension and she can then withdraw that. That counts as income and that doesn't count towards the lump sum and death benefit allowance. So that means I can pass on effectively as much as I want tax-free on death before 75. So that's the two main allowances that we have going forward. So some of you will be in the position where you've taken some money already. So you've taken some money out of your pension before 2024, and the new rules apply from 6th of April 2024 onwards. So in that situation, what we need to do is take into account the benefits you've already taken and adjust what your allowances are remaining to use going forward. So to make things more complicated, there's two ways of doing that. So there's a standard basis. The standard basis assumes that you took 25% of the previous benefits as tax-free cash. And for many people, that will be correct. And if that's the case, you don't need to do anything because what probably looks quite a complex calculation on the screen there. We would do that, your scheme administrator, whoever runs your pension scheme would do this calculation, so you don't need to do it. You would need to tell them how much lifetime allowance you've used previously, but that would be on your annual benefit statement or whatever you get from your pension scheme. That would tell you that. You give that to the new scheme, they would work out that you took 25% of that as tax-free cash. So in this example, that works out as 170,000. You take off that 170,000 off the 268, and you've got about 160,000 to use moving forward when you take any future benefits. The slightly complex bit is there's a second option, and the second option is called a transitional certificate. So effectively, if you hadn't taken 25% tax-free cash from a previous scheme, you can effectively stick your hand up and say, I didn't get 25% tax-free cash. Can I deduct the actual amount of tax-free cash I got rather than making an assumption? So in that situation, you would have to provide evidence of the monetary amount of tax-free cash you'd previously got. But say in this example, that was £100,000 rather than 107, is as long as you could provide evidence that you got 100,000, we would take that 100,000 off the 268 and you would have 168,000 to use moving forward. The really complex bit there, unfortunately, is this is a kind of irreversible decision. It's a one-way street. If you stick your hand up and ask for a transitional certificate, you have to use it, and it could result in a worse outcome than the standard basis. So that's not ideal. We would have liked the government to allow us to do both and kind of offer you both, and you could choose the highest, and that would be a nice position. Unfortunately, the government's not gone down that route. The government said you use the standard basis. If you stick your hand up and want the transitional, then you're stuck with that, whether it's higher or lower. So great care needs to be taken before you use a transitional certificate or before you ask for a transitional certificate, and certainly an area that you might want to take advice before you get involved in. And then the final bit I just wanted to touch on is death benefits. I've probably already covered this to some degree, but again, just to confirm, death benefits under pensions, generally no inheritance tax, which George mentioned earlier. Beyond that, it's when you die, it's the age at which you die that becomes crucial. If you die before 75, generally benefits are paid tax-free to your family. But there is this limitation on a lump sum, and that is a limitation of the 1,073,000 or whatever you have left if you've used some of it. Any excess above that would be taxed as if paid as a lump sum. But if you can pass it on as income, so if you can pass it into a pension for your wife, for your kids, for your husband, whoever it happens to be, then it can generally be paid tax-free. So that's kind of, that top right is really where you want to try and get to, I guess, other than you've died, which is not necessarily ideal. But from a tax perspective, that's kind of a perfect place to get to. If you die after 75, then it's taxed as income in the beneficiary's hands. Whether that's paid as a lump sum or an income doesn't matter. Again, that's not necessarily a bad outcome. So there's lots of ways that passing on money after you die, it can be subject to significantly higher tax charges. It could be subject to inheritance tax, things like that. So pensions are still in not a bad position generally, because you can pass it on tax efficiently. So as long as you can pass it on maybe to someone who pays lower levels of income tax, you can maybe pass it on to grandchildren or something like that who might be paying very low levels on no income tax at all. Again, effectively, it can be passed on very tax efficiently down through the generations. So that's me. Hopefully, I tried to make it as simple as possible. Unfortunately, some of it is complicated. So I will now close off these slides, and I'll pass back to George.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great. And who would have thought the government would have made it so appealing to die early? So that was really great. So just one thing I want to kind of touch upon before I kind of finish the question that I had hanging is that one thing that Andrew touched on the death benefits, especially death benefits pre-75, they seem to have gone really very generous. The key thing that I would be checking is, do you have nominations up to date, and are you sure on the death benefits of your scheme? That's really, really important. And Andrew, just maybe chime in here if that's okay. But my understanding is, with a lot of providers, if there isn't a name on the nomination, so let's say you don't name your kids, that can mean that some can only pay out lump sums, and therefore you can't necessarily always designate to income if they're not on the nomination. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, that's correct. So we could always pay it out to what's termed to be a dependent, but a dependent's quite a closed group. So that would be a spouse, or it would be children under 23. But given the ages we're talking about, it would often just be a spouse or partner. So it's important. Absolutely agree with you. It's important people complete what are called expression of wish or nomination forms, and that just tells us who they would like the money to go to, and that allows us to set up pensions for a much wider range of people and pass it on much more tax efficiently.
That's great. So yeah, so the key take home is know what your pension death benefits are if you don't already. Make sure your nominations are up to date once you've found out those two bits. The only other bit that I want to touch upon that you mentioned about transitional certificate, again, my understanding is what this means is that you lose the ability to even get a transitional certificate in place if you have what's called a relevant benefit crystallization event. So you take benefits after the next tax year. That's correct as well, isn't it? Which means there's a real time scale element here.
Yeah, so if you take any tax-free lump sum after 6th of April, you've lost that ability. So you need to apply for a certificate and have received a certificate before you can take any money. And that might take 2-3 months, depending on who you speak to. So yes, there is a time constraint involved.
Great, thanks so much, Andrew. And just the reason why I wanted to just kind of highlight those is because, look, guys, there's a lot changing here. We're currently working our way through with clients. I would suggest this is something to just keep a keen eye on if you're someone that's likely to be affected. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen again. Just bear with me for 2 seconds. Okay, fine. So let's bring us back. So just talking about, I mentioned before, what gets a better review, client feedback than Apple. There is something called the Net Promoter Score, and some of you may have already dealt with this through your work, but it's run by a company called Dimensional. The stats I'm going to be bringing up in a second. But how the Net Promoter Score works is that if you get client feedback, it has to be above 9 or 10 for them to be considered a promoter. If someone gives you an 8 or a 7 out of 10, they're considered as a passive. So somebody that is passive and doesn't count towards the Net Promoter Score. If they're considered 6 and below, they are a detractor. So they'll be taken off your Net Promoter Score. So very simply, the Net Promoter Score is promoters minus detractors, and that's your score. And as you can imagine, because let's be honest, we're British, we don't tend to say things are amazing. getting a high Net Promoter Score is a bit of a challenge. So if we have a look at all the different companies here, so Apple, probably widely regarded as one of the greatest brands in the world. Netflix, generally quite highly regarded. eBay, Delta Airlines, less so. If I was to tell you that advisors in the Dimensional International Investors Survey, which is basically a whole host of advised clients via Dimensional, who are a fund group, came out a much higher score than Apple, effectively what this is saying is that financial advice through firms that use these dimensional funds scores higher on client satisfaction than Apple. And look, I get that is self-serving, but I bet you weren't expecting that. And I just want to talk about why that's the case, because strangely enough, that's something that we see day in, day out as far as client feedback. And if you spoke to someone in the street and said, you know, what's your view on financial advice? I bet they wouldn't have given you this score. And I think my view is because Dimensional tend to work with planning centric firms. They tend to work with firms that operate on a basis where they're planning first. I've shown you not too long ago about the fact that I think the plan comes first because this is the lifestyle that you want to achieve. It's about making sure you've got enough, how we can make the best decisions today. Following from that, is there a purpose to your assets? Are you making sure that you're managing tax? Are you invested in the right things? And then finally, it's the partnership. It's basically making sure that, yes, you can have the greatest plan in the world, but how do we make sure that it keeps on track with things like legislative changes, with lifestyle changes, all the things that will happen in your life. And one of the big, I told you about avoiding expensive mistakes. Well, look, there are concerns and there are costs before people reach out to us. And there are, the concerns are, should I do something now or wait? Is the process of advice worth it? Am I going to get ripped off? I'm not going to lie. It's a question for many people. How do you work out who's good? Will you be better off for the time and effort? And there is a problem sometimes about not planning effectively, which is that it can lead to inertia. Providers are really hard to get hold of. That can mean no coherent investment strategy, no tax strategy, which means you overpay in tax, wrong provider features, missed opportunities with allowances, and just not knowing what the right level of spending is. So a key part of that is basically having a financial plan. And my big suggestion would be, whatever your decision is in relation to how you engage with your finances, try and get some form of financial plan. And I'm just going to show you an example and then add a bit of context in relation to how this would work with the new lump sum allowances. So in this example, I've got two individuals at 50, a daughter at 20. They're employed, they're earning a decent amount, one earning 115 grand, the other earning 70. We've got some cash holdings, their family home, various pension providers doing various things, including some defined benefit schemes. They've got your state pension kicking in later, their mortgage, and they've got, some retirement goals. They've got some, what they want to spend in retirement, what they want to use towards holidays and enjoying life. And we will build together a timeline of goals, aspirations, and taxation and everything, which will look kind of like this, where you've got things like, maybe the daughter leaving university, paying the mortgage off, maybe wanting to reduce your hours in the business, retirement, maybe a house deposit, big events like World Cups. And what this allows a planner to do is bring everything together, do all the analysis, and then answer the big question of, have we got enough? Are we going to be okay? And in this example, what this would be showing us is the red is effectively showing us that you are running out of money. And what this blue is showing us is that you are currently spending, you've got more money coming in than your expenditure, which is the black line. And what I would be saying as a planner to this client is I'd be saying, we've got big problems because statistically, of a couple, you have got a 51% chance of one of you living beyond age 90. And the plan is showing us that they've got money running out at age 86. So even on a really simplistic level, this clarity allows us to go, okay, we need to take some action. And part of great planning is bringing the future into the present so we can do something about it now. There's no good learning all this stuff at 60 or 70. We need to do something now. And then my job as a planner is to go in and go, okay, what happens if we use some of your surplus income for additional contributions? What happens if we maybe use some phasing of tax-free cash when you come to retire? And just by making these little tweaks, being a bit more intentional, that's before even going into things like, that's looking at the investment performances and looking at the charges and all the rest of it. You can see that there are significant changes. So in this example, just by these little tweaks, We're still not where I'd want us to be, especially after stress testing the details. But we've gone from 86 to 94 as far as the run out ages. And then when we consider things like tax strategies, we can look at the comparison between the two and go, okay, well, if you take option one, you're going to be in a position where you're paying considerably less tax, and we've got money that's going to be lasting. We're going to got funds which are expected to be lasting for longer. So this is just an example, but it shows you about the power of proper financial planning where you're looking at all the strategies. And in relation to the lump sum allowances, how this would, another example of how this might impact that is that, for example, maybe you've got someone who's got defined benefit schemes and a defined contribution arrangement. I know that's one of the questions that we've had raised. Well, in this example, I'd be calculating, okay, what's the defined contribution scheme? When is that going to get the maximum level of tax-free cash? What are the factors with your defined benefit scheme? And when can we look at the strategy for drawing down on these benefits? So it's about looking at things on a holistic basis and bringing everything together. So we're about to do the Q&A now, because I'm keen to kind of go into some of the questions. But just before we do, I just want to kind of highlight that at the end of this session, you will get access to our retirement quiz. And I've designed this specifically so that it can give you a really good answer of how on track you might be for retirement. Clearly, it's not going to be the same as financial advice, but it's going to give you a good guidance on how on track you may be, and also give you some suggestions and some pointers from how you can improve it. In addition to that, is if it's something that you do want to maybe consider in more depth, you can have a completely without obligation and without charge chat with either me or one of my colleagues where we can talk about planning strategies and how we may be able to help. So that's something you can do after you've done the quiz at that point. So that's it from me. I think we're going to dive into the Q&A if that's all right.
Thanks ever so much, George and Andrew. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, we have had a lot of questions come through, so we'll do our best to answer them. And I'll also do my best. I see we've had a few questions come in on the chat, so where I can, I'll kind of pull out where some themes are coming through. But the first one I'm going to put, I'll put it to George to begin with. So one question we had was, I'm 4 years away from retirement and lucky enough to have a pension value above the current lifetime allowance. I've scaled back my pension contributions as a result. Should I change tactics?
Yeah, so firstly, congrats on the pension saving. I can imagine that's not been easy, so well done. Look, while I can't be specific because I don't know your full situation, so this isn't formal advice, just guidance. I would not be looking at things as a planner on the basis of I'm near the lump sum allowance or the lump sum death benefit allowance, and therefore I'm going to stop all pension funding. I'd certainly be revisiting that consideration. And the reason why is because, well, we talked about the pre-75 position is now very different. If you were to pass, I don't know what the legacy position is around your situation, if you have inheritance tax considerations, but pensions are exceptional vehicles now potentially for legacy strategies. I'd also be considering the wider stuff, like, so if you've scaled back your pension contributions, did that come at the cost of losing employer contributions? Because if it did, then you could potentially have lost out on some really valuable employer contributions, which would make revisiting that position definitely worthwhile. So while the lifetime, I've seen this through a few potential clients as well, while the lifetime allowance is important to be aware of, and the new lump sum allowances are important to be aware of as well, I would not make a decision purely based on these limits, because there can be lots of other considerations, and you may find that you could be better off even with continuing contributions. So yeah, Andrew, any thoughts on that?
Just really to reiterate, I think employer contributions is a massive point there. So if you kind of lost or given up your employer contributions going into your scheme, then that's potentially giving up free money effectively. So that becomes hugely valuable to reconsider. Yeah.
Right. So that's next one.
So I purposely selected this because a few people asked a very similar question. So this person has said, I'm fortunate to have a pension above the LTA, but cannot access it until 2026 when I'm 55. Any idea how long Labour will take to reverse the abolishment? As I said, there's quite a few questions from people asking what happens if Labour do come into power at the next general election, as they've already stated that they would reinstate the LTA. Who wants to pick that one?
I'll start and then leave Andrew to the end. So from a planning perspective, look, it's really frustrating for all parties concerned. By the way, this flip-flopping around pension rules, no one's happy about it. We can only work with the rules at the time, because it's complicated, and I don't think we can ever really second guess these things. We can only really plan with the rules. Andrew, from your side, what I'd really value your input is that you see it at the provider side, and my understanding is you've had a meeting recently with HMRC involved. Am I right in saying that? What's your kind of take on how easy it is to reverse things like this? Because this is a lot of stuff coming in.
Sure. It is. So we can't really give a definitive answer, because it's what a politician might do in 2 years' time, and hopefully everyone understands that's not easy to predict what's going to happen. So bringing the lifetime allowance back in is not a simple measure. So taking it out, we've seen taking it out has taken a year, and it's taken a year, and we've run it very, very tight. We still don't have all the legislation. We still don't have all the guidance. It should probably have been a 2-year timescale rather than a 1-year timescale, but it was pushed through for political reasons, for different political reasons. So to put it back in is not straightforward. It was 100+ pieces of legislation to take it out. So realistically, we're probably talking a year to put it back, minimum. If, let's just say, there was an election later this year and Labour did win, even if it was top of the list and they went for it, we're probably talking 2026. Could they try and do some sort of anti-forestalling rules? So do something to try and stop people taking money out in advance, possibly. But equally, this is not going to be top of a new government's list. So they're going to be looking at, tax and NHS and lots of other things. This is not top of the list. The other political issue we've got is with unions, because this affects, one of the reasons it was abolished was because it potentially affected doctors, dentists, air traffic control people, who are quite high earners, and the unions involved with those professionals would be very against it being brought back in. So it's unlikely that a new government would definitely want to hit against, into a potential problem with a union immediately. So partly I think it's unlikely, and then the second part to the answer, sorry, it's quite a long-winded answer. The second part to the answer is any time pension changes have been brought in history, it's generally not retrospective, it's generally forward-looking, and that's why we've got complexity and layers of protection and things like that in place. So, and I don't think it would change that. So if they brought it back in, I think it would be from a future date. So say 2026 onwards. The big question mark would then be what kind of protection regime they would put in, what special rules would they put in place for people who've got money beforehand. And I think that's impossible to say, mostly because I don't think Labour have thought about it, to be honest. So it's a really hard position, and I accept it's a hard position. And it's not easy for us to plan as a business either. I think all you can do is try and make the best of what we have at the moment, and it's really difficult trying to second guess what might come in the future.
Thank you. I'm picking up a particular question because somebody has asked in the chat if we could pick up on defined benefit pensions. So one question that came in advance was, I would like to know more about the LTA and how it affects someone like me who has 2 DB pensions in payment at around 90% of my LTA, and who has taken 115,000 in tax-free cash. I also have a defined contribution scheme worth close to 300,000 that I'm still paying into. It's quite a lot there.
Okay. Yeah. That sounds specifically like a transitional certificate one, doesn't it?
It does. So again, can't really comment on the specifics of an individual issue, but when I talked about the assumption is that you've taken 25% of previous benefits, that's the standard assumption. most people in a defined contribution scheme, that's probably correct. The ones that probably taken less are more likely to be in a defined benefit scheme, and that's just due to the way the scheme rules work. So if someone's got less than 25% tax-free cash, that could be a situation where they want to apply for a transitional certificate, and that might allow them more tax-free cash, which is obviously a nice position to get into, as an ability to take more tax-free cash going forward. But as I said, there's nuances around that, so we just need to look at each case, because some people could be worse off, but some people could benefit.
Yeah, I think that's that's a fantastic example of one where how challenging this is for advisors and God knows, for people trying to figure it out themselves, because what you kind of need to do is you need to do both calculations, but also before applying for the transitional certificate, because the transitional certificate is irreversible, is my understanding, Andrew. Is that correct? Which is,
yes.
So let's say that you got the calculations wrong. That's an irreversible decision, so you're screwed, unfortunately, without putting too much of a thing on it. But that's the problem. And the fact that you've got to have this in place before your relevant benefit crystallization event after 6th of April 2024, that is a lot of jargony words. That basically means that, let's say you're taking continual income from a drawdown pot, like phasing of income or whatever, that is a relevant benefit crystallization event. And at that point, the rules are going to revert to the new basis, which may or may not be better for you on the tax-free cash summary. Is that a fair summary, Andrew? That's kind of basically where I'm at with it.
It's really difficult without looking at specific figures. It's really difficult to say which way to jump. But yes, if you have a defined benefit scheme and you've taken less, or you've received less than 25% as tax-free cash, that's definitely a situation where it might be worth investigating it and trying to look at the numbers.
Yeah, I'm only laughing because it's such a challenging position for so many people that are in that kind of example are going to find themselves in. It's, even for advisors, it's really challenging. So
yeah, it's not really a helpful way to write legislation.
No.
A helpful way would be to look at both and pay a higher amount, but unfortunately that's not where we are.
Yeah. All right. Next question, Celeste, if that's okay.
A related question in the chat is somebody who has taken their defined benefit pension without a lump sum back in 2019 and believes that they would need to get a transitional certificate. However, they don't have any evidence that they did not take the lump sum. Is that something that the scheme administrator would be able to help them with?
Yes, hopefully. So that's a difficult one, because it's obviously difficult to prove a negative. So it's difficult to prove you didn't get something. So yes, I think the best place to go is to go back to the original scheme and ask them if they can confirm that no tax-free cash was paid. And hopefully they will just do that by writing a letter or an email or whatever it happens to be. And as long as that's got the scheme name on it and it confirms that no tax-free cash is taken, then that should be acceptable to whoever you ask to provide a certificate. But yeah, it's a difficult one, because, as I said, just because not normally, if it's a smaller amount, you've got a record of that smaller amount, on a document somewhere. But if it's zero, it might just not mention it at all, in which case it's more difficult.
Okay, so another question we received in advance. Is it the case that 3 additional SIPs of less than £10,000 each can be accessed with 25% tax-free, in addition to the PCLS allowance of £268,275? Would you like to take that one, George?
Yeah, sure. My understanding is small pots, as it used to be called, effectively is now, they've maintained it, so it's the same, doesn't reduce your lump sum allowance, assuming it fits the same rules as small pots did previously. Is that still the case, Andrew? Just to double check.
Yes, it's a very well informed individual. So yes, it's a lesser known bit of pension legislation, is that you can have a few little pots dotted about, and you can effectively take them, and then you can take your big pot and measure it against the main allowances. So yes.
Okay. Next one.
Another defined benefit related question. How do I determine valuations for frozen DB pensions with former employers? I've been told that if you multiply by 20 the annual pension plus the lump sum, that equals the pension value. By doing so, it looks as though I'm already halfway into my lifetime allowance. Do you want to have a go at that one, Andrew?
Yes, so yes, under the old rules, under the old lifetime allowance, exactly what the individual said, to measure so a defined contribution is a monetary amount, so it's easy to measure against the 1 million or so because you've got a pot of money. A defined benefit scheme is an income that's paid, so we have to turn that income into a notional value. And so what we took is the annual income that was being paid, multiply it by 20, and then add on any tax-free cash, and that's the total value of benefits. However, an individual shouldn't have to do that, so they should get an annual statement from from the pension scheme, and on that it should tell them the percentage of lifetime allowance that's used. So hopefully the individual doesn't need to do that. Somebody should have done it for them and should tell them each year how much that is. And if we go forward into after April, into the new world, if a pension starts after April, we don't care about the income. All we care about is lump sums moving forward. So that's one of the bits that does make it easier going forward, is that defined benefit income we just don't measure, we don't care about going forward.
Yeah, it's going to make things a lot easier, I think, once we're through all these transitional rules. Like, it's, the kind of the framework, especially for defined benefit, assuming you've not already taken it, is going to be easier, because it's just going to be whatever your DB pot and whatever you decide to commute takes off your lump sum allowance, basically.
Yes, absolutely. But the difficult bit, as you say, is people who've taken some money before and are going to take some money afterwards, and that's a complicated bit.
Oh, Celeste, you're on mute.
Thank you. I was just saying, I think we've got time for a couple more.
Okay.
So how do the new rules work when you have a combination of SIP and old final salary schemes? The old complicated formula for working up the equivalent DB amount of lifetime allowance has presumably been revised, or is still as previously applied. I have a reasonably large SIP plus 2 old final salary schemes, so want to make sure I have the total LTA amount covered.
Sure. Okay. I'll take that one. So again, assuming you've not taken any DB benefits before, I think the question is that they've not taken any DB, and these are just deferred benefits, so benefits that are yet to be taken. Going forward, as long as you're taking benefits after the 6th of April 2024, things should be somewhat simpler, because effectively you're going to have a defined contribution pot which you can then measure the growth and see whether that is going to maximize your lump sum allowance. And then you can just take a decision whether your defined benefit schemes, whether you're going to take tax-free cash, what's called commuting, and look at the trade-off. So you could theoretically, let's say you've got 2 DB schemes, and again, this isn't advice specific to you, this is just general kind of talking it through. Let's say you've got 2 DB schemes and you decide you want to take the full pension from that. You could theoretically let the DC pot grow to an extent, if it's a larger pot, till it exceeds the 1,073,100, and potentially take DBs without taking any tax-free cash, and just take your tax-free cash from the defined contribution. Now, on the old rules, that would have really hit you hard for the lifetime allowance, because the DB was based on a times 20 basis. But on the new rules, assuming you're going to crystallize after this next tax year, that's going to be at least easier to do the calculation. That makes sense, Andrew? That sound like it makes sense? Yep, makes sense to me.
Excellent. Well, we're just coming up to 7 o'clock, so I feel it's probably best that we leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Andrew, for coming along to the webinar and covering the more technical aspects of this really complicated area. And thank you very much to George. Finally, just to mention again, a disclaimer that this is advice and education. This is not formal financial advice. If you do need to discuss your personal circumstances, then as George said at the top, we're very pleased to have an initial consultation with you to see if there's something we can help you with. And finally, just to mention, after this webinar has finished, you will receive an email with a recording of the session, but also a link to that retirement quiz that George mentioned. So you're very welcome to complete that and see what your score is in terms of your retirement readiness. Lovely. Well, thank you again.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
You.
Cheers.
Good night.
Bye.